I never thought I'd say these words. Not out loud, not publicly, not even in the quiet moments when I allowed myself to think without the weight of the world pressing down. But here it is. I'm retiring. Not someday, not after another world tour, another album, another award. Not after another milestone that the world would call success, but I would call exhaustion. I'm stepping away from the version of Kim Taehyung that everyone thinks they know, the one they see on stage under the bright lights, with cameras and cheers and schedules that leave no room to breathe. I've been chasing moments like that since I was a teenager, dreaming in small rooms on floors that weren't mine, surviving with little and hoping that someday, somehow, the world would notice. And it did. Everything I imagined and far more than I ever dreamed came true. But dreams, I've learned, have shadows. And sometimes the very success you fought for becomes the cage you never asked for. For years, I told myself it was worth it. For the fans, for the music, for the art I wanted to create. And in many ways it was. Music has changed lives, has given voice to pain, joy, love, loneliness. But in the middle of it all, amidst the relentless cycle of producing, performing, touring, and pleasing expectations, I realized something quietly terrifying. I didn't know how to stop. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't know who I would be if I did. I am 30 years old. Still young, people say. Still decades of work ahead. Still songs to write, stages to perform on, decisions to make. But for the first time, I asked myself, why? Why continue running when my heart is whispering for stillness? Why chase applause when those I love are passing through life quietly, waiting to be seen? Why negotiate schedules and approve plans when the thing I need most is something simple, tangible, human? I realized I was tired, not just physically or mentally. I was tired of being a machine in a world that celebrated output over presence. I forgot what it meant to simply exist in a space, to truly see someone, to touch, to connect, to be human. A few months ago, I visited an elderly care center. Not for appearances, not for photos, not because someone told me to. I went with a friend, accompanying them to see their grandparents. I expected quiet rooms, bland furniture, schedules, maybe some soft music. But what I found shook me. Elderly people waiting. Waiting for a hand to hold, a smile, a voice. Waiting for someone who stopped long enough to simply exist with them. Their eyes told stories of decades, of love, loss, longing. And I imagined my own grandparents there, waiting, unseen. And I realized how absurd the noise of my life had become. Tour schedules, awards, deadlines, chart rankings, all meaningless if I had no presence in the world I truly cared about. So I made a choice. I'm opening a home for elderly people, not just funding it, not just attaching my name, but working there myself. As a person, not an idol. As someone who listens, who learns, who is present. I imagine a place filled with sunlight, gardens, kitchens, music rooms, spaces to share meals and stories. A home, not a facility. A place that feels lived in, warm, human. And yes, people will think I'm crazy, that I'm wasting my career, that I should be performing, producing, expanding my influence. But none of that matters if I've lost myself in the process. I'm choosing meaning over momentum, presence over prestige, people over productivity. I'm not disappearing. I'm reshaping my life into something real, something aligned with the person I am now. But the story doesn't stop there. Because even as my heart was drawn to this quiet calling, the machinery of the music world continued around me. Inside the company, my absence sparked speculation. The studio was silent when they expected music. My usual hours vanished. Producers whispered, managers wondered. Why wasn't Taehyung where he always was? I wasn't hiding. I was creating space for something unexpected, something unpredictable. I turned off notifications, disconnected from the constant demands of schedules, and retraced my own path. I revisited the places where my earliest inspirations were born, the quiet streets of Daegu, the hidden cafes where I first wrote lyrics, the basement studios where I taught myself patience through failure and repetition. Not to recreate the past, but to remember why I climbed in the first place. Alone in those spaces, without cameras, without deadlines, I allowed myself to experiment. I played the piano imperfectly, scribbled lyrics without judgment, recorded melodies on my phone just to hear them exist. I rediscovered freedom, the thrill of creating without expectation. And in that freedom, I found something I had long forgotten, my own voice, raw, human, vulnerable. Meanwhile, rumors swirled at the company. People speculated about projects, solo work, or a breakdown. The truth was simpler. I was reclaiming my mind, my creativity, my heart. And in that process, I realized that stepping away from the predictable wasn't retreat, it was preparation. For something daring, something authentic, something completely my own. While I was rediscovering myself in those quiet spaces, the world I had left behind carried on in ways I couldn't control. The office whispered my absence like a ghost in the hallways of Hybe. Producers glanced at empty chairs, managers scrolled through calendars, and even the most seasoned coordinators wondered where Taehyung had gone. People speculated, some with worry, some with impatience. No one knew that what I was doing was not avoidance, not rebellion, it was preparation. I needed silence. I needed distance from the endless cascade of expectations. The usual questions: when's the next release? Will it sound like your old music? Had become chains. Every notification, every update, every casual mention of charts or awards threatened to pull me back into a rhythm I no longer wanted to follow. So I stepped away, quietly. Not dramatically, not to shock anyone. I simply removed myself from the predictable patterns I had been trapped in for years. The first sign of this transformation came in the way I approached music. I returned to my roots, not metaphorically but literally. I went back to the basement studios where I first learned to translate feelings into melody. Cheap acoustic foam, flickering lights, mismatched furniture, but those imperfections grounded me. I wasn't there to create a hit or to impress anyone. I was there to remember, to touch again the raw excitement of unfiltered sound, to hear myself for the first time in years. In those days, I played with reckless freedom. I pressed keys without caring about harmony, recorded rough vocals on my phone, scribbled lyrics without judgment. It was messy, imperfect, and chaotic, and it was mine. In that chaos, I remembered why I loved music. It wasn't fame, it wasn't applause, it was discovery. It was the thrill of finding a new sound, a hidden emotion, a word that cut to the heart. The second step in my journey took me to a small, hidden performance bar in Seoul, a place where underground artists gathered. The stage was tiny, the lights dim, the equipment worn. It was alive, buzzing with raw energy. I didn't go to perform. I didn't want recognition. I simply observed. Young rappers, singers, dancers, artists giving pieces of themselves in tremulous, confident, passionate bursts. Watching them reminded me of the version of myself that trembled on stage before the world believed in me. The version that fought for every note, every lyric, every heartbeat. Their vulnerability reminded me of my own. The rawness of their art reminded me that music is not meant to be safe, polished, or predictable. It is meant to speak, to disrupt, to be human. And I realized something essential. I had been performing, creating, and existing in a world that celebrated perfection, and in the process, I had lost the courage to be imperfect. I had lost the courage to be me. Meanwhile, back at the office, the tension was growing. Producers speculated, assistants scrolled schedules, managers whispered theories. Some thought I had withdrawn to plan a secret solo project. Others feared I was dissatisfied, even angry. The truth was far simpler and far more radical. I was becoming something no one expected. I was preparing to respond not with words, not with a statement, not with a carefully staged performance, but with action. Action that would challenge the assumptions about who Taehyung was, what he could do, and why anyone had ever measured me by metrics, schedules, or public expectation. Because after years of following routines, delivering perfection, and managing personas, I realized that growth requires risk. True expression requires vulnerability. And so, I began dismantling the version of myself the world recognized, not in rebellion, but in honesty. My first act was subtle. I disconnected from the constant digital hum, turned off notifications, and refused to engage in routine communications. Not to ignore people, but to give my mind space to breathe. I revisited old compositions, drafts, and melodies I had stored away, not to recycle them, but to reconnect with the essence of creation itself. To remember the excitement, the frustration, the tiny victories of early experimentation. Every day I noticed a subtle shift in myself. My mind, once clouded by deadlines, expectations, and the constant push for more, became clearer. I began to hear things I hadn't noticed before. The softness of piano keys, the texture of a vocal tone, the weight of a lyric that had been buried under perfection. And slowly, imperceptibly, a new vision began to emerge, one that was bigger than the routine, more daring than the safe path, and entirely my own. Then came the quiet confrontation that would define the next chapter of my life. 2 days after my isolation, I requested a private meeting with Bang Si-hyuk. It was not confrontation, it was clarity. No one knew what the meeting was about. I didn't share. I didn't hint. But inside, I had made a decision that would reshape everything. I was no longer content to meet expectations. I was no longer content to live in a space dictated by others' perceptions. I wanted freedom. Creative freedom, human freedom, the freedom to explore, fail, succeed, and grow on my own terms. When I entered that office, there was silence. Not awkward, not tense, silent with anticipation. I didn't announce a plan, I didn't plead. I simply expressed a truth. I wanted to create something that scared me, something that challenged me, something that demanded vulnerability, honesty, and courage. And in that moment, everything changed. Bang Si-hyuk didn't resist. He didn't argue, he listened. And then, with a quiet nod that carried decades of understanding, he said, "Then go make it." That approval ignited something dormant inside me. But the real shock was not what I was about to create, it was how I would do it. I would dismantle every expectation, every assumption, every preconception about who Taehyung was before rebuilding it anew. Step by step, note by note, decision by decision. Not in public, not for recognition, but in pursuit of truth. And so began a journey of transformation that would ripple through every corner of my life. Personal, creative, and public. A journey that started in silence, in forgotten studios, in quiet streets and dimly lit bars, where I could remember what it meant to be human, to create, and to live authentically. After that private meeting, everything shifted. The world I had always navigated, the bright lights, the cheers, the carefully constructed schedule, suddenly felt distant. Not irrelevant, not forgotten, but secondary to the process I had started. The real work, the work that mattered, had nothing to do with public expectation and everything to do with honesty. I returned to my old spaces, revisiting corners of soul that had shaped me long before BTS, long before stages and awards, long before anyone even knew my name. In one small, nearly abandoned basement studio, I sat alone with a battered keyboard and a notebook full of scribbles that were years old. The walls, still covered with cheap acoustic foam, smelled faintly of dust and time. I touched each key deliberately, not to produce perfection, but to remember the feeling of sound itself. It was messy, imperfect, human. I recorded fragments of melodies, some incomplete, some barely recognizable as music, and yet every note felt authentic in a way my polished recordings rarely did. Here, mistakes were not failures, they were proof of life. I allowed myself to experiment in ways I had long denied. I layered sounds that clashed, rhythms that resisted conformity, lyrics that rambled before finding clarity. I didn't worry about whether anyone would understand. I didn't even worry if I would. I just created. And in that freedom, I began to hear the beginnings of a new sound, a voice that was mine entirely, that had been buried beneath years of expectation. But it wasn't only about the music. The quiet moments, the absence of cameras and deadlines allowed me to confront myself, to ask questions I had never allowed. Who am I if I stop performing? Who is Taehyung without the accolades, without the applause? What does it mean to live fully beyond a schedule or a persona? These questions weren't easy. They were uncomfortable, even terrifying. Yet in the discomfort, clarity began to emerge. Next, I visited a small performance bar where underground artists gathered. The lights were dim, the stage low, the audience intimate. I didn't go to perform. I went to watch, to learn, to feel again the vulnerability of those willing to put their art on the line without guarantee of fame or recognition. Young musicians trembled, laughed nervously, stumbled through lyrics, poured their hearts onto that tiny stage. I remembered the same trembling, the same hunger I had once carried. I sat in the back, quietly observing, and for the first time in years, I felt inspired in a raw, human way. Watching them reminded me that art is not defined by perfection or commercial success. Art is defined by truth, by courage, by the willingness to expose yourself in a way that might hurt, that might fail, that might be misunderstood. That night I realized that everything I had achieved, the accolades, the tour, the awards, while meaningful, had often come at the cost of that vulnerability. I had been playing a part, even when it was a part I had loved. But now it was time to strip it away. Back at Hybe, speculation about my absence reached new heights. Whispers in the hallways turned into questions, which turned into concern. Producers, assistants, and coordinators tried to piece together where I was, what I was doing. Some feared I was planning a solo project. Others worried I might be upset or dissatisfied. The truth, though, was not something they could anticipate. My path was not about ego or defiance or anger. It was about reclaiming agency, reclaiming authenticity, and preparing to respond not to the world, but to myself. And then I began experimenting in ways that startled even me. In my quiet spaces, I composed music that fused genres, textures, and emotions I had never explored publicly. Orchestral strings intertwined with subtle electronic glitches, vocal samples warped and layered, percussion that was simultaneously delicate and industrial. Each track became a story, a statement, a reflection of a mind unbound by expectation. I wasn't trying to please anyone. I was trying to understand myself. Producers began to notice small signals. Studio 3, usually filled with the soft hum of work, was silent. My usual hours vanished. Notes and sketches from my private sessions leaked only through whispers. People noticed a change in my demeanor, more introspective, less reactive, sharper in observation, quieter in speech, yet somehow carrying more weight. Every silence, every glance, every deliberate choice was a signal that transformation was underway. 2 days before the public announcement, I requested access to every composition, sketch, and melody I had ever stored. For someone who rarely revisited old drafts, this was unusual. I wasn't looking for inspiration, nor was I hunting for an easy solution. I was remembering why I had begun creating music, remembering the joy before the pressure, the excitement before the schedules, the love before the expectations. This archive became a mirror, reflecting both who I had been and who I could become. And then came the moment that would quietly, irrevocably shake those around me. I entered the main studio alone, holding nothing but a simple USB drive. No announcement, no preamble. I connected it to the speakers. The first note played and the room fell silent. The track was unlike anything I had created publicly. It was raw, experimental, vulnerable, and yet undeniably me. Orchestral swells collided with digital distortion. Vocals were intimate, almost whispered, yet layered with emotion that demanded attention. The transitions told a story in real time. Every producer froze. Every engineer held their breath. No one spoke. I didn't ask for feedback. I didn't explain. I simply said, I haven't shown even half of what I'm capable of. And I left. The silence remained heavier than the music itself. That 6-minute track was not just sound. It was a declaration. A reminder that the Taehyung people thought they knew was only one version of me. There was more, always more. And now I was ready to show it. In that moment, I realized that true transformation does not come from reaction. It comes from deliberate evolution. I wasn't angry at critics, nor was I trying to prove anyone wrong. I was proving to myself that creativity cannot be contained, that vulnerability cannot be measured by charts or applause, that music and life must be felt, not simply performed. And while the company buzzed with speculation, I quietly continued my journey. The next days were spent revisiting inspiration, sketching new melodies, experimenting with sound in private, observing young artists, and remembering the essence of being human. Every step I took was deliberate, every choice intentional, every silence purposeful. By the time the first whispers of my absence began circulating through Hybe, I had already mapped out the path I was taking, not for anyone else but for myself. It was quiet, deliberate, and painstakingly personal. I wasn't disappearing, I was reconstructing. Every choice I made, every location I revisited, every melody I sketched, every minute of silence I allowed myself, was a building block in the life I intended to step into. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance between solitude and observation. I wandered through neighborhoods that had inspired early BTS tracks, revisiting cafes where I had scribbled lyrics in notebooks that now felt like relics of a different life. The smell of coffee, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversations, they were grounding. They reminded me that life existed outside of deadlines, that music existed beyond charts, and that my own presence mattered more than any projection of perfection I had once chased. Evenings were spent in quiet reflection, sometimes on rooftops overlooking the city, sometimes in dimly lit parks, sometimes simply in rooms filled with nothing but a piano and soft light. I allowed myself to remember the tremors of insecurity I had felt as a young trainee, the self-doubt, the uncertainty, the fear of failure, and I recognized how much those feelings had shaped me. But now, they weren't burdens. They were reminders of courage I had carried all along. I also started observing younger artists more closely, not to mentor, not to guide, but to learn from their raw, unfiltered approach. In dimly lit underground bars, I watched performers pour every ounce of themselves onto the stage without fear of judgment. Some stumbled, some laughed nervously, some whispered apologies into the microphone, but every one of them reminded me of the thrill of unpolished vulnerability. I remembered the nights I had felt the same, clutching a microphone, praying the audience would understand, and I realized how far removed I had become from that pure, unrefined excitement. While I immersed myself in this personal rediscovery, tension at Hybe escalated. Producers, managers, and coordinators began to notice the pattern of absence. Meetings were missed, check-ins ignored, studios left empty. The company buzzed with theories. Some speculated about secret solo projects, some worried about dissatisfaction, and some simply didn't know how to interpret my quiet withdrawal. Yet all of this was inconsequential. I had withdrawn not to rebel, not to hide, but to reclaim a version of myself that had been lost in the relentless pursuit of expectation. Then came the preparations that would ultimately lead to the revelation that stunned everyone. I began experimenting in ways that were unconventional, unpredictable, and deeply personal. I recorded pieces that were intentionally unfinished, layered melodies that clashed, and explored vocal techniques I had never dared use in public. Every note was deliberate, every silence intentional. I was reconstructing my voice, my art, and in essence, my identity. A critical part of this process involved revisiting archives of past compositions, melodies, and sketches. These were files I had rarely touched, relics of a time before fame and pressure had reshaped my relationship with music. I sifted through them not to recycle, but to remember, to reconnect with the impulses, the raw emotion, the sparks of creativity that had first propelled me into this life. Each fragment, each discarded melody, each rough lyric was a reflection of who I had been, and more importantly, who I could become. The more I immersed myself in these quiet explorations, the clearer the path forward became. I realized that the life I had been living, the schedules, the tour, the expectations, the accolades, while incredible, had trapped me in a version of myself I no longer recognized. To move forward authentically, I had to break free of that cycle. Not for spectacle, not for shock value, but because my own integrity demanded it. The turning point arrived on a morning when I quietly entered Studio 3, the space that had been a constant presence in my life for years. Instead of the usual sessions filled with engineers, producers, and assistants, I arrived alone. I loaded a simple USB drive containing a 6-minute track I had created in secrecy. When the first notes played, the room, though empty of people, seemed to vibrate with significance. It was unlike anything I had released before. an amalgamation of orchestral strings, subtle electronic glitches, unconventional rhythms, and intimate vocals that revealed vulnerability I had long kept private. The music was not designed to please or impress. It was a statement. It declared that I had evolved, that I was no longer the same person the public expected, and that my art would no longer be confined by the comfort of familiarity. The track ended, and I left the studio without comment. Silence, as always, carried more weight than words. It was my way of signaling that the transformation was real, deliberate, and irreversible. In the days that followed, the tension within Hybe was palpable. Colleagues speculated about the purpose of the track, the meaning of my absence, and whether this was a precursor to a major announcement. No one could predict the full scope of what was coming, nor did they understand that this was only one step in a larger, deeply personal journey. Privately, I continued my work in quiet spaces, moving from old basement studios to hidden performance bars, and even to parks and rooftops where I could create without interruption. Each location offered a different perspective, a different stimulus, and a different opportunity to reconnect with the core of my artistry. I explored new sounds, experimented with unconventional techniques, and challenged myself to abandon everything that had become predictable. All the while, I was preparing for a revelation that would not just surprise the industry but redefine it. I understood that people would interpret my choices in various ways. Some would admire them, some would criticize them, and some would simply be confused. Yet none of that mattered. What mattered was authenticity. What mattered was choosing a path that aligned with who I was now, rather than who the world expected me to be. And as I continued this private evolution, I began to feel a profound sense of clarity. I knew that the next steps would be both shocking and necessary. I knew that to embrace this new chapter fully, I had to confront the most difficult truth, that some of the decisions I had once believed were permanent, sacred, or untouchable needed to be reconsidered. That to grow, I had to step away, not just from expectations, but from the very patterns that had defined my public life. This was the calm before the storm, the quiet that precedes revelation. And in that stillness, I finally allowed myself to imagine a life defined not by schedules, accolades, or public approval, but by purpose, presence, and authenticity. A life in which I could be human first, artist second, and icon third. And in that imagining, I found the courage to make the choices that would shock everyone, choices that would ultimately lead to the announcement that would change everything: my retirement. The announcement came quietly, yet it reverberated across the industry like a shockwave. Fans initially thought it might be a rumor, a miscommunication, but soon it was everywhere. Taehyung was retiring. The words themselves felt impossible. The idol who had dominated stages, awards, and hearts across the globe was stepping away. And yet, for those who had watched him closely, for those who had glimpsed the subtle changes, the signs had been there all along. I remember the morning vividly. I sat in a sunlit studio, the faint hum of a piano beneath my fingers, and allowed myself to feel the enormity of what I was about to do. Retirement was not about giving up or running from responsibility. It was about choosing life on my own terms, prioritizing presence over productivity, and embracing a form of contribution that went beyond applause. I was ready. Fans' reactions were immediate and intense. Social media erupted with disbelief, sadness, and a whirlwind of speculation. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the idea that this was a temporary pause, a publicity stunt. Others mourned as though losing a friend. Messages poured in, some filled with gratitude, others with confusion, and many with personal stories of how my music had touched their lives. It was overwhelming, yet humbling. I read them all silently. Every message reminded me of the responsibility I carried, not as an entertainer, but as a human being who had connected with millions through art and vulnerability. Meanwhile, inside Hybe, the atmosphere was charged. Producers and coordinators scrambled to understand the logistics, the implications, and the emotional impact on the company. Interviews were scheduled, statements drafted, and crisis protocols prepared. But the truth was that no protocol could fully capture the complexity of what was happening. This wasn't a simple resignation. It was a personal evolution, a statement that art, life, and presence were inseparable. In the days following the announcement, I stepped into a new rhythm. No tour schedules, no recording deadlines, no cameras. Instead, I focused on visiting the spaces I had envisioned months earlier: nursing homes, small community centers, and quiet neighborhoods where elderly people lived alone. These visits were not about charity or recognition. They were about presence, about listening, about human connection, about understanding the rhythms of life that existed outside of fame. One visit stays with me above all others. I entered a nursing home that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, with halls lined by doors behind which lives had unfolded for decades. I sat with people who had stories, dreams, regrets, and wisdom that had been largely unseen by the world. Some smiled faintly as I approached. Some stared into space, waiting for someone to care, to notice, to acknowledge that their lives still mattered. I listened. I held hands. I laughed softly. And in that silence, I found a fulfillment I had never felt on stage, in studio, or on a world tour. This work, intimate and human, reminded me that significance is not always measured by applause or charts. Some of the most profound moments of my life were simple: conversations with an elder who remembered struggles similar to mine, a quiet smile from someone who felt seen for the first time in months, a story shared that illuminated resilience, patience, and love. These were experiences that could not be monetized, marketed, or broadcast. They existed in their purest form, and I was fully present to witness them. Back in the public eye, the media tried to define the narrative. Headlines speculated endlessly: Taehyung quits music, a career cut short. From stardom to silence, YV is leaving the industry. But the truth was more nuanced. I was not abandoning music, I was reclaiming life. My relationship with creativity was evolving, not ending. Songs, compositions, and ideas would continue to emerge, but on a timeline and in a manner that honored authenticity over expectation. The response from colleagues in the industry was mixed. Some were supportive, understanding that the relentless pace of fame could be suffocating. Others were skeptical, questioning the practicality of leaving such a career at its peak. Yet I remained resolute. I had witnessed too long the ways in which people, even well-intentioned, can become trapped by expectation. I refused to let that define me any longer. Fans began to notice a change in me, not just through words but through actions. I shared moments from the nursing homes, the quiet streets, and the intimate experiences that brought meaning beyond the spotlight. There was no showmanship, no need for grand gestures, just presence, just connection. Slowly, people began to understand that this retirement was not a retreat. It was a step toward something deeper, something real. The juxtaposition of public shock and personal fulfillment created a strange energy. On one hand, the world expected grief, confusion, and loss. On the other, I felt peace, clarity, and excitement for the path ahead. I had shed the weight of expectation, leaving behind a version of Taehyung that had been admired, scrutinized, and loved, but also confined. In its place, a human being fully aware, fully present, and finally free emerged. And yet, despite the calm I felt internally, the emotional weight of departure was undeniable. Saying goodbye to the stages, to the lights, to the fans I had grown alongside was painful. Each step, each farewell carried memories spanning a lifetime of music, travel, laughter, and tears. But I knew that the measure of life was not the accumulation of accolades, but the depth of experience, connection, and authenticity. In private moments, I reflected on the journey. I remembered my beginnings in Daegu, the uncertainties of trainee life, the long nights spent composing, and the leap into global stardom. I remembered the pressure, the exhaustion, and the relentless pursuit of excellence that had defined so many years. And I realized that every step, every challenge, every triumph had prepared me for this moment. The courage to step away, not out of fear, but out of love for life itself. This transition was not only personal but philosophical. It was a rejection of a life measured by metrics, applause, or visibility. It was an embrace of a life measured by presence, authenticity, and impact on human connection. Music remained, but it no longer dominated my existence. Instead, art, empathy, and real-life experiences intertwined in ways I had long yearned for. And so, as the world reacted, as fans processed the shock, and as the industry speculated endlessly, I quietly moved forward. My days were filled with people, stories, music, and life, not scheduled, not dictated, but alive and present. The retirement was not an end. It was a deliberate, courageous transformation, a reclaiming of self, a redefinition of purpose, and a statement that living authentically is the most profound form of artistry.